Thank you. I'd like to just pick up on where Edward left off because I think his statements are very relevant. We have to stop thinking of this as a zero-sum game. Oh, Asian capitalism versus American capitalism, globalization versus anti-globalization. Actually, we're misusing these terms. I look at the anti-globalization protesters who successfully disrupt every IMF, World Bank, World Economic Forum, and in the past G8 meeting. Are they for anti-globalization? No. They're brought together, they're often very diverse, unrelated groups, brought together by calls for environmental protection, often protection of their own indigenous lifestyles, or simply having supplements for grain so that they can actually maintain their traditional farming lives. Actually, they're unrelated, but they bring themselves together with the very tools of globalization, internet, mobile communications, and they're using it more advanced than anybody else. Actually, I believe if the issues on the table were globalized healthcare, globalized standards for the environment, prevention of AIDS cures, these protesters would be partying on the street, not protesting. We're actually using the terms wrong. But what does bring them together is an antithesis to something we call the Washington Consensus. And often we use this term without knowing what it means. What is the Washington Consensus? Yes, in 1989, a guy named Williamson wrote a formula for development in Latin America. But that has become associated with a series of shock formulas involving sudden liberalization of capital markets, sudden liberalization of foreign exchange, immediate privatization of state-owned enterprises, which often shock and damage a country which is not ready to apply these things without a more gradual approach. It was the application of these formulas post-97 Asian financial crisis which battered Asia. The other underlying premise, we talk about capitalism in Adam Smith, the assumptions. The assumption of the invisible hand. The invisible hand will equalize all markets. Well, that's nice if you have complete information all the time in all markets, but you never have that. And in developing countries, it's impossible by the nature of their transition and development. Moreover, we take the assumption the invisible hand is driven by greed, and greed will equalize all markets. I think our assumptions are wrong. Is everybody in this room motivated by greed only? I don't think so. People are motivated by their culture, their heritage, their quality of life, and spirituality. We've left too many pieces out of the equation in our assumptions. In going forward on this, the problem is applying one system, one theory, or one method to development. As Edward Chan explained, China defied that one theory that had been applied. During the 1990s, China adopted a gradual approach, rejected the IMF, World Bank, shock therapy, rejected all of this because it had to gradually phase in the changes that were necessary to liberalize its market, create a market economy out of a complete socialist economy, to be able to bring in the means of production, to be able to create the financial mechanisms and financial system to allow that. It meant entire social change, a change which is still going on today. But I went to China. I first moved to Asia almost 30 years ago. I've lived here more or less ever since. In those days, China had no material goods whatsoever. If you had the money, there was nothing to buy. 10 years ago, we were talking about China being the factory of the world. Today, we talk about China being the bank of the world. It has the largest holder of U.S. assets, treasury assets. It dominates world trade. It dominates world resource extrapolation. And even today, in the news, Obama has had to appoint an envoy to North Korea for bilateral talks because China has had it with six-party talks. The influence of China now is increasingly predominant by virtue of its economic size and transformation. I worked very closely with the government over the 1990s on the reform process. And I remember sitting with Zhu Rongji at the Great Hall of the People and asking him, what do you think about at midnight when you're signing off on an economic decision? What theory, what's the basis of making that decision? And he responded, the social psychology effect on a herd of sheep. It doesn't matter how good your economic theory is. If you can't motivate the psychology of your people, it's absolutely useless. In that respect, we have to look at the application of models. Some of our models are outdated. We talk about democracy. You look at an organization like the World Economic Forum, 153 members, only 20 get in the meetings to make the policy decisions. We talk about the G8. Now it's the G20. Why did it become the G20? We never used that term until 2005 when the WTO negotiations broke down in Cancun because China, India, Brazil, and a host of other countries came together on the issue of grain subsidies and because the protesters outside refused to let that meeting continue. And there were actually deaths of Korean workers at those protests. I commend those protesters. Because of their efforts, the G8 transformed into the G20. We need a G40. We need to continue the process of multilateralism because our organizations, our institutions have not been able to keep up with the times. A year ago this time, George Bush held a meeting in the US. Oh, we're going to have another Bretton Woods, and the G20 came. It is not another Bretton Woods. The institutions have not kept up, and new institutions and organizations are rising. I commend the Chiang Mai Initiative, Korea, Japan, China, and ASEAN, coming together with a regional stabilization fund for currencies. This is a direct result of the experiences these countries faced in the 1997 Asian financial crisis. We need new solutions, and these solutions will increasingly become local solutions or regional solutions. Today we're talking about an Asian economic community. That community is already forming. We ourselves are simply reflecting the fact that the tectonic plates of our financial system and trading system are changing. The yen, the Chinese currency, is now being used in countries all around bordering China freely in exchange. China is signing swap agreements left, right, and center. The influence of this region is coming together on its own. We talk about Beijing consensus, Washington consensus. I also don't believe there's a Beijing consensus. The approach and experience of China is unique for many reasons: its population, its size, and its experiences. So will India's approach be unique. So will Bangladesh. So will all the countries of this region. We can have different approaches. You know, we have to stop by adopting what I call 3 pillars of Himalayan consensus. 1, throw out the theory. If the theory doesn't work, don't use it. Adopt pragmatism, and pragmatism comes from the people. Most of the time, people in these countries in Asia know how to solve their own problems. They just need to come together and have the opportunity to do it. Second is values. With shrinking global resources, we need to look more back to our Asian values of a global community. We are a great village. We need to think out. It's not just, I grew up in America, there's no free lunch. You work hard and you get. No. In Asia, it's different. The Himalayan values are, if I am rich, if I am wealthy, I owe it to society to give back. It's karma. We have to give back what we take. We need to adopt compassionate capitalism, not American capitalism or Asian capitalism, compassionate capitalism. This is increasingly being popular among small companies, growing companies, which are not thinking and not being valued just on how much money they make, their P&L or their shareholders' value, but being valued on what they give to their communities and what they do for the environment. And third, each government must have its own form of representation for its people. Healthcare, education, and creating an environment which supports the private sector to grow are key. If a government is not doing that, it's dysfunctional. What form it takes The voting process is less important than the results it's delivering.
Very much. Our next speaker is Mr. Bray.
Thank you. I was extremely impressed, and I wish to applaud Kim Chi-ha's speech today, particularly his use of the symbol of water, which I'll come back to in a minute. Yes, let's look at the I Ching gram for water and fire on water. That's the symbol for revolution, because two opposites self-extinguish. I don't believe that we should have one supreme view or another of East versus West, because both are merging very fast with globalization and internet, and the values can be self-generating and harmonious. I appreciate the statements that were made about my country, America. Yes, we have a very good education system, but I must say some of the most robust creativity occurring in the country today is because of a relatively open immigration system which allows talent from Asia, from Latin America, and from elsewhere in the world to come into that country. I was recently in New York. You're with a Sikh taxi driver, you're eating halal food on Wall Street at a stand. This is the creativity energy of other places, diversity. We as people are defined by our diversity. If we take that away, well, we're pretty homogenous and not terribly interesting as people. In that is creativity. In this, I'm also calling for a revolution, but a peaceful revolution. One that's built on common sense, not the suppression of one ideology. Fundamentalism, whether it's religious, economic, or political in any form, does not support creativity and harmony in this world. I call for common sense approaches. You know, we need this with economics. How can you have theorists sitting in an icebox somewhere else in the world, going across the world, telling other people how to run their economies? I think it's a joke when IMF advisors show up in a developing country and talk about village economics when they themselves have never spent a night in a village. We also need to have a kind of compassionate economics. We need to bring in sort of values of Asia. I mean, the rich values of this part of the world, whether it's Hindu, Buddhist, Islam, we have either zakat or almsgiving, care for others. In a world with increasingly finite and diminishing resources, we have to change our values of consumption. I don't believe that our stimulus packages that are increasing consumption are going to solve our economic problems, because actually overconsumption is the cause of our problems. We need to find new ways to balance. From these philosophies, these ideas, we have many indigenous solutions. For instance, microfinance, pioneered by Mohammed Yunus in Bangladesh. This is a very indigenous concept. It comes from many of the roots of Bengali society, village society. But now, microfinance is being used to solve the problems of America in New York and Detroit. It's being introduced as a way to solve our own urban problems. There's no supremacy in one ideology or one economic system. Diversity is our answer. You know, we have many cars in our parking lots in America, and some people live in houses the size of palaces, but they're also emotionally dysfunctional and spiritually void. So we can talk about branding. Well, the biggest brand in the world today is yoga. People are practicing it to address this very issue all over America, because we are synthesizing the values of Asia, because after 8 years of neoconservatism, unnecessary wars which have bankrupted our financial system and ruined our credibility throughout the world, we need a new economic paradigm. It's not Washington consensus. It's also not Beijing consensus. I call it Himalayan consensus because it's all embracing and expansive of Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. We need to bring ourselves to one point, and that is water. I come back to what Kim Chi-ha said about water. The glaciers of the Himalayas are melting at such a fast rate because of CO2 emissions that we are nearing the tipping point. I live in Lhasa. The snows now do not form on the Himalayan plateau until January. Normally it's covered with snow from October until March. If we tip or we go over that tip point, which is nearing very quickly, the rivers of the Yellow, the Yangtze of China, the Salween, Irrawaddy, Mekong of Southeast Asia, the Brahmaputra, Indus, and Ganges of South Asia will have no water, and 2/3 of humanity will have no water to drink. This is a potential crisis, a Darfur, expanding 2 continents, and we're heading right into it. This is the point of communication. We must bring together all the countries of Asia. I initially call for a trilateral between America, China, America, and India, the 3 largest CO2 emitters, to talk about innovation of technology and science and business, which requires government support to turn around this crisis. I'll leave you with one thought. We can give our children money, but can we give them water to drink? Thank you.
More comments, please? Or questions? Yeah, over there.
I think it is distorted to always accuse the Asian values of being something less than universal. In my opinion, in Asian countries, whether in China or in Singapore, where I come from, or in Korea, where we are now, it is actually important to bear in mind that many of the things that we hold dear, which we don't call it values, have already been accepted for centuries. For example, many of us in Asia respect family. Many of us in Asia respect meritocracy, as Professor Roland had mentioned. And many of us in Asia respect education, the acquisition of knowledge. And this is why many of us in universities, in wherever we are working, are contributing to innovative solutions to our modern world. So if you look at such things that we have in our respective Asian societies, there is a lot of values, if you like, but I would say universal ways.
I think the Asian community is already upon us. It was created or driven by economics, but it will be sustained by values. Just reflecting on response to predicament, look at Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans and the federal government's response. Look at the tsunami that hit Southeast Asia a few years ago and the response of Asian countries to helping out other Asian countries. A year ago, the Sichuan earthquake was disastrous, but it was not only Chinese, but Asians throughout Asia who responded to their fellow Asians.
We went into debate about East and West, but we did not go into debate about humanity. One thought that came from Larry about the importance of water. Water is a requirement for all living beings, which is humans, animals, and plants. In my presentation, I have brought you something which is known as Ayu Bhovan, which is a Sanskrit word which gives you my prayer to have good health and long life.
I'll tell a very simple story, an incident so small, but it changed my life. When I started working in Tibet, one morning I woke up and I went to the street and bought some naan, like Tibetan bread, and it cost 80 cents. And there were 3 little beggar children who grabbed me. Now, coming from white America, which is supposed to be neoliberal, whatever, where said, oh, no free lunch. Everybody works for themselves. Never give money to beggars because they'll always want more. These are the things we're taught as kids. The Tibetan lady selling me the naan took the 80 cents, put 50 cents in her pocket for the sale, and took the other 30 cents and pulled the children aside and said, please, don't bother the foreigner. It will give him a bad impression. Here, 10 cents for each of you. Go off. I learned a lot from Tibetan people living in the Himalayas, and I'll share my philosophy today. Take only what you need, but give back as much as you can. That is a universal Asian value. Thank you very much.